Welcome to TeleGeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and we're in part 2 of a 2-part series here that we're doing, where I wrap up the year 2022 with 6 of my colleagues across several of the different research areas that we have here at TeleGeography. So if you missed last week, go back and listen there, where I talked to my colleagues Patrick, Rob, and John about internet, cloud, pricing for transport and other services, and then of course data centers with John Yembo and what's going on in the data center world, where there's developments, how inflation and supply chain issues might be impacting pricing, energy, all that kind of stuff. We're going to bring it back specifically to the kind of whole gamut of telecoms in this episode. I'll first be talking to my colleague Alan Mauldin all about submarine cables, what happened this year, how they were impacted by the inflation and supply chain issues that we've heard so much about across all kinds of news, and what the landscape of submarine cable development looks like over the next couple of years. I talked to my colleague Brianna Boudreau about SD-WAN and get into a little bit of security there certainly as well, in thinking about what SD-WAN vendors are really sort of focused on and where the enterprise market is in its SD-WAN adoption journey. And then finally talk to Tim Stronge, who directs all of our research here at TeleGeography, and get into some of the ways that telecoms actually impacts kind of the broader world out there, rather than just focused on this sort of inside the industry kind of trends that we so often do on the podcast, but look at some major world events, as I kind of phrase it in the interview, both human and natural disasters, if you will, and what that means for the telecom world and for all of us as consumers outside of the business even. So it's a few really interesting conversations again. So without further ado, let's get on to the interviews. All right. My next guest is Alan Mauldin, who's research director of the infrastructure team at TeleGeography. Now, Alan, you are in charge of all of our infrastructure research, but in particular, you are our expert on submarine cables. And I have to say, as I travel around the world and talk to people like this, submarine cables are what people know TeleGeography, I think, the most for, in my experience. So that kind of makes you the face of TeleGeography in a certain sense.
And what a handsome face it is, Greg.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a good thing this is an audio podcast this round, because I'm playing Santa Claus for a performance. My beard is in a state of like half dyed white. But you have a lovely tableau with your Christmas tree. Joining us from, where are you located, Alan?
In Bratislava, Slovakia, the heart of Europe.
Indeed, the Eastern European TeleGeography office. But that's good time zones, because you can kind of stay connected from a Central Europe time zone to both Asia and the Americas, right?
Absolutely. It's perfect. Right in the middle.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So I want to talk about submarine cables with you, obviously. And it's been my impression over the past few years that there's been a boom in submarine cable construction. It does seem to have a sort of boom and bust cycle, like a lot of economic activity. Are we still in an ongoing boom cycle with cable construction? What's going on with submarine cable development?
Yeah, you're totally right. There's been a really large boom in new cable builds and new investment in cables, really all over the world. According to our data, there's about $10 billion worth of cables being built that will enter service this year and the next 2 years. So that's a lot of money going under the ocean for new cables. Mm-hmm. And this past year, we started to see some of these cables that have been planned for many years finally entering service. So we had the peace cable between France and Egypt and Africa and the Middle East entering service in the spring, and the Southern Cross Next cable in the summer. And this fall, we had the Grace Hopper cable across the Atlantic and the kind of unique Oman, Australia cable also entering service. So, and we should be hearing, I guess, this month, maybe early next year, about the activation of the Equiano cable, the first new cable hitting the west coast of Africa in quite some time. So that's a big one.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So now let me ask you, you said finally coming into service. Does that mean that they were delayed from their original RFS dates due to like COVID and whatnot? Or is it just that it's been such a long time we've been hearing about these cables that it feels like, oh, they're finally here?
It's the latter, really, I think. It takes a long time for cables to go from the design stage, a concept, getting a contract in place, to actually building these cables. And there was a report just this past week. Somebody at Alcatel Submarine Network said they are currently negotiating contracts for installing cables after 2024. So they are full to lay cables the next 2 years. That's one of the biggest suppliers of subsea cables. So if they can't put a cable in the water for 2 more years, you can get an idea of just how full they are with new cables that are going to be laid, up until 2025. And of course, there's still more cables planned, right? There's not an end in sight to this boom. Really, there's more being planned constantly.
And so my question then becomes, because we know with such a lead time that these cables are coming, and we know roughly how much lit capacity there will be on them, right? Does the market kind of absorb that new supply ahead of time, so that we can easily predict what the impacts will be on the market?
So it's definitely true that whenever new cables are going to enter service, often we see some more aggressive price erosion from the operators who are currently on the route, trying to get some of the extra demand in the market, get some extra sales before they face a new competing cable on that route. But this year pricing has had an interesting twist. There's been delays in upgrades to cables, a shortage of supply on many routes, which has led to prices staying the same in some cases, or declining at a very slow rate. That's also due not just to the delays in upgrades, but also due to higher cost of equipment as well. So we're not seeing prices going up, but we are seeing a slowing rate of erosion. Right, that's a very key point to make clear there.
I think it's going to be doubled, because I did talk to Rob a little bit about this in the broader context, not just submarine cables too, but and so I think that's been a big question on everybody's mind. So in the submarine cable world, there has been some supply chain impact, but it hasn't actually led to increased prices, or it sounds like from what you're saying, actual like missed RFS dates or anything like that so far.
RFS dates, often do get pushed back for cables. Just to be clear, for people who don't know what RFS means,
in every kind of market.
So a RFS date is the ready for service date, when the cable actually enters commercial service. You can buy capacity on it, and so those dates, they're planned years in advance, but often they will slide due to many factors. Can you get the ships available that you need to lay the cable? Are there weather delays? And one of the biggest factors these days is permitting delays. You have to get so many different types of permits to lay the cables. And so those delays have led to many long delays, especially in Asia. You're seeing cables like SJC2 and the ADC cable, which had hoped to be in service years ago. Those now are targeting maybe the end of next year, maybe even 2024. Wow.
That's interesting. I have also talked to our colleague John Yambo, and he mentioned some regulatory issues with development of data centers. So it seems like everyone this year has had on their mind supply chain issues and inflation, but these are really factors outside of those sort of like common economic factors that everyone else is talking about that are kind of going to be present regardless of what the global sort of economic COVID-driven situation is, it sounds like.
Right.
Excellent. All right. So you talked about this a little bit, but let's look at the next 12 to 24 months and talk more specifically about exactly what we think is coming and how that's going to impact things.
Yeah, so there's a lot of new major cables that will be entering service next year. The Amitié cable between UK and France and the US is going to be entering service next year. That's a very high capacity cable. The
And that's interesting because the transatlantic route has historically always been the most well-served route with supply and whatnot, but there's room to grow still there.
Absolutely, and we're seeing about one cable a year really. So
Hmm.
this year we saw the Grace Hopper cable. Next year is the Amitié cable, and there's a Meta-led cable planned for 2024. So lots of new
Mm.
cables happening in the Atlantic. In the Pacific next year, Google's Topaz cable should be in service. That's kind of unique. That's a Canada to Japan cable. So haven't had one going
Mm.
from Canada to
Wow.
Asia in quite a long
Now is that
time.
is that going over the North Pole or is it
It is not.
it's just going across the Pacific? Because
Yes.
I suppose the North Pole would be very difficult from a practical standpoint, but geographically that would make a lot of sense, right? So,
Right.
yeah. Um, Interesting. You mentioned Meta and Google. I also wanted to ask about content providers and cables. It's been the big story over the last few years. Has any of that dynamic changed in 2022, or do you anticipate it changing in terms of just first bring us up to speed on what the content provider involvement in submarine cables has been for the last few years for anybody who's not up on that, and then to is that going to continue the way it has been?
Right. So to be clear, we're talking about really Google and Meta, to a lesser extent,
Hmm.
Amazon and Microsoft as being the companies who have taken a step the last, 10 to 15 years to actually invest directly in cables themselves and not just acquiring capacity
Hmm.
from carriers on these routes. And so they are the biggest investors on many of the major routes and are expanding into new areas as well. So the Equiano cable is a Google cable, which is going to enter service again like this month or early next year. Also next year, we're going to see the start of the To Africa cable entering service, which is a massive, like 45,000 kilometer cable spanning,
Wow.
Europe, all around Africa, the Middle East, and India. So that's going to start entering service
Hmm.
in phases. And there's activity really everywhere. Google has the Fermina cable going from the U.S. to South America, right? So
The West Coast. That's the West Coast one, is it?
it's East Coast. It's a
Oh, it's East Coast.
Brazil,
Okay.
Argentina, and Uruguay. Yeah, all those three countries are going to be hit by
Okay.
that cable. Yeah, um, but I think one question we've been asked a lot recently is with the market pullback and the stock prices of these companies falling, and layoffs at various companies, is that going to have an
Hmm.
impact in the capex for these companies, their appetite to deploy new cables? And so I think from what we understand, there is not going to be a massive slowdown or a reduction. There's going to be maybe some time to rethink and be more cautious about their investments
Hmm.
and be more careful, not just keep build, but you need to realize these companies are right now involved in so many cables that haven't yet entered service.
It'll be
That so
years before that is all dried up, right? So
Absolutely
yeah.
right. So they don't have to focus on building a cable for 2028 right now. That they can take a
Hmm.
pause and not work on that right now. They definitely are fully. They stated they intend to commit to what they have already planned to build. So
Hmm.
in the Pacific, you have Echo and Bifrost and Topaz and multiple cables. Apricot in the intra-Asian area. There's lots of cables globally that have yet to actually enter service. And so once those get done, I think you will see a new round of investment by these companies happening in new cables. And to be clear,
Hmm.
this past year, I can't think of really a single cable that was announced that involved a conduit provider. This year's been a bit slow
Mm.
for new cables being announced, but
Hmm.
that's just maybe just the nature of the build cycle.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. This is submarine cables are a massive infrastructure undertaking.
It's
There's
long
only
term.
a handful of
Yeah,
very specialized suppliers who can actually do the sort of turnkey work, and so you're not going to see the immediacy of impact in things like quarterly earnings reports as you might in other sectors
that's
of
absolutely
various
right.
technology
Yeah,
industries.
yeah. I mean, just because the stock price has fallen, that doesn't mean that the demand for that company's services has
Hmm.
decreased as well, right? There's no
Right.
indication that the demand for bandwidth by Meta or Google or any of these companies is going down or really even slowing that much. It's still growing at a very strong rate, and they will need to have more capacity in the future to meet those requirements. So,
yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to close out. Patrick and I talked about this, how at the very local level, ISPs and 5G providers are always getting more bandwidth to more eyeballs, and that all trickles up to the need for constant development in the submarine cable space. So you'll have lots to do, I guess, right? So, yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me from Bratislava, Alan, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Happy to chat as always, Greg.
All right. Cheers. All right. Next on our year in review show, I have joining me Brianna Boudreau, who is our senior research manager for SD-WAN, among other things, but SD-WAN is what we're talking about here today, Bri. And I wanted to start out with something that we've seen in our survey data of end users, that it looks like the number of enterprises that have SD-WAN actually already running up on their network is a little bit lower than where I would have personally guessed that it would be. And that's important since I design our forecast of WAN services model. But so we're, what's up there? Has uptake slowed down? Are people not interested in SD-WAN, or what do you think's going on?
No, I think interest is still really high across a lot of the enterprises that we talk to, and certainly the vendors and carriers that are seeing interest from customers in it. Part of it is deployment timelines. I know that when we did the latest version of the WAN Manager survey, the number of enterprises that had installed it across most of their sites was only 50%, which is slightly higher than the 43-ish% we saw 2 years ago, which seems like a small increase for a technology that is kind of one of the biggest buzzwords in the industry. But part of that really
for the last, like 5 years, right?
I know.
So, yeah.
I feel like any conversation you have at any conference with enterprise carriers, customers, is about SD-WAN, SASE, which we'll get to. But it has taken a lot longer to roll out across networks than I think maybe a lot of us realized. I know that in the latest version of the WAN Manager survey, about 70% of respondents said it took over a year to deploy SD-WAN across their network.
So it's not the plug and play, like, is easy thing.
No, zero touch install.
Like, exactly.
And just plug it in, it works. Yeah. It hasn't quite worked out that way. Part of it also is COVID and all the supply chain issues factoring into this. I know this has
come up in most of my conversations with our colleagues here. So yeah.
Exactly. Especially for SD-WAN appliances, getting those to customer sites. I know I was just at the SD-WAN and SASE Summit last month, and a lot of the vendors were saying they were hit pretty hard with supply chain issues, and that they were quoting customers over a year to get those appliances onto their site. A lot of them said that's mostly resolved itself now. So maybe we will see that deployment start to increase steadily the next time we run the survey. But it definitely has been an issue that's kind of slowed down SD-WAN deployments. But again, interest is high. I know some of the providers I talked to at that event were saying they've never had more customer requests for the service. So
excellent. Okay, so my forecast maybe isn't that far off. There's just going to be a little lull over the 2020 to 2023 kind of period for the supply chain to catch up.
Exactly. We just got to catch up.
And people to be in offices and stuff like that, right? And so now everyone's back, and so we can start working again.
And that was another thing they said, was that it wasn't just getting the appliances there, it was getting their crews there to help enterprises install the service. During the height of COVID, that became a big issue, getting people on site, and that has worked itself out slowly as well.
Right. Okay. So SD-WAN still going to continue growing. It will become most likely, it's not ubiquitous, but very, very common technology like MPLS became 15 years ago. Yeah. That's still underway. Good to know. The other big story, it seems to me, over the past couple of years in the SD-WAN space has been the integration of security. We've talked a lot on the podcast about SASE and whatnot, but what have you seen from the SD-WAN provider perspective, since that's your sort of focus in this particular area of research, in terms of security integration into SD-WAN services?
I think it's hard to have a conversation these days about SD-WAN with a vendor and not talk about security. It's really become, you're not just offering SD-WAN, it's about what features in the security space you're integrating into it, particularly those in the SASE architecture, like next-gen firewall, secure web gateway, CASB. The interesting thing has been there's kind of two ways to offer it, and which way the vendors are going. You can there's those that are kind of a one-stop shop. They offer all of the individual security features, whereas other vendors have partnered with best-of-breed providers to help enterprises get those features as a part of their SD-WAN offering. So,
now the one-stop shop that you mentioned for security, so would some of those be the security vendors who got into SD? So you can come from one direction to the other, right? There's a security vendor who gets into SD-WAN, or there's more like an equipment SD-WAN vendor who can add on security? Is that the primary dividing line?
Exactly. And there's a lot of discussion about what is the easiest for the enterprise to deploy, what's the most seamless in terms of integration of all these features. Like coming from a security background like a Fortinet or a Cisco, they know all those services are interoperable. They can deploy them across your network with their SD-WAN. Whereas if a vendor is partnering with different providers for these services that specialize in that service, it may be the best of breed, but how are they all going to work together? Is it really going to be that single pane of glass for enterprises? So there's pros and cons to both. And that's been a big part of the discussion this year.
Yeah. And I suppose from the enterprise perspective, you could go in a couple of directions too. It's that I could have a single pane of glass from an MSP carrier, or I could go find the best in breed for every single one of these elements. But that seems like
is it worth their
whatever
time
benefits
and the headache?
Exactly, yeah. So very dependent on what kind of IT infrastructure budget and expertise you have on board, I guess.
And a lot of the standardizing of those services so that they integrate is going to be a focus going forward. I know that you're friendly with all the people at MEF, and that's been a big thing that they've taken on as well recently to make it easier for enterprises.
Right. Actually, absolutely. So to know that what you're getting and that it will work with what else you have. Right. Yes. So very important. The last thing I wanted to touch on, Brianna, was we'd seen a lot of consolidation over the past several years in the SD-WAN space, which we predicted, which is nice always when the things that you think will happen do. Has that slowed down? Have we kind of reached a market stability, you think, in terms of SD-WAN providers?
I think so. There's like a top 10 household names that always come up when you're having these discussions and you see out at the industry events for sure. And it's not kind of that everyone has an SD-WAN story that we saw a few years ago with smaller upstarts being purchased by bigger providers. We kind of, at least on the vendor side of things, have kind of a stable of the most popular providers for sure. And a lot of carriers have partnered with a number of those vendors at this point to be able to offer different SD-WAN solutions based on network requirements, price points, stuff like that.
When you look at carriers, MSPs, are most of them selecting more than one, so that if you go with them as an MSP, you can still make a decision between one of the big, Silver Peak or Viptela or whatever it is, right?
I think so. At this point, we see like 2 or 3 partners is usually the most common amongst the MSPs to be able to offer a variety to their enterprise customers.
So no longer are you that worried about like, oh, if I pick this kind of like startup one, if I'm a multinational enterprise, that everything's going to change for me when they get bought by a huge equipment vendor, let's say.
No, I think the most popular, at least vendor partners for the carriers, are in it for the long haul at this point. So we've moved past that phase.
Excellent. That's good to know. All right. So what are we looking for in 2023? What are you going to be tracking for the SD-WAN space?
I think a lot of it is looking at pricing still, which is always a popular topic with everyone. How much is the cost of this overlay going to be in terms of what your network looks like? Last year, we saw some convergence in provider price points. As this service becomes a little bit more standard, people are positioning themselves to be a little bit more competitive. We saw that range between vendors shrink. And I think we're going to see it continue this year. I had heard that some
probably
people...
thanks to your research, like it's the principle that like you've brought order to that chaos, and so now they have to compare themselves, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mess still, but we're getting through it. But people have said that they've been making some readjustments to become more competitive. And so we're still analyzing the data. It's going to come out early next year, but I expect to see that trend continue.
And what about price increases? That's another thing I've talked about with several of our colleagues, that, all of these things that we mentioned, supply chains and labor issues and whatnot that have been happening. Is that going to impact the cost of SD-WAN, you think?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag so far. We've had a few providers hold pricing steady, and that's probably to absorb some of their cost increases. A few that we saw on the lower end of our range did make some price increases this year to readjust for inflation, and we're pretty transparent about it. Still fairly competitive in terms of the spectrum of vendors out there, but there is some of that being felt on the SD-WAN side with the cost increases.
That's very interesting. And then my last question then would be around the SD-WAN in the mix of the broader WAN costs. And I know that I can ask you this because you worked on a series with me about hypothetical WAN scenarios and whatnot. So if we do see some slowdown or arresting of price declines in the WAN space, and maybe even some slight upticks in SD-WAN, what's the impact on that calculus of say moving away from MPLS, adopting SD-WAN and internet first? Does that change that scenario, you think?
Maybe a little bit, but I don't think that much. I think overall, if you are able to add in SD-WAN and move to integrate DIA and broadband, the cost savings, the last time we ran these scenarios, was so large, even if there is a slight increase in the proportion of SD-WAN that you're paying for, you're still going to achieve network savings if you're moving away from that MPLS. So I don't think we expect that to change.
That is good to know. All right, Brianna, thank you so much for joining me. This is really interesting. And it's always good to know that that some of the things that I've been writing about and thinking about aren't wildly off from what you end up seeing in the data. So,
no, exactly. Thank you for having me, Greg.
All right, cheers. Okay, so you've heard from a bunch of telegeography analysts about the trends that we saw going on this year and what we see coming next year. My last colleague that I want to have on is actually the head of all of our research, our vice president of research, Tim Stronge. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. And so you get to kind of capstone this with something a little bit different, which is, where did telecom come out of our little sort of niche world and enter into the sort of broader news that people not involved in the business might have heard about, and kind of involve itself in world events? I think you're going to talk sort of about, you might call it natural disasters and human disasters, and how that impacted telecoms.
Yeah, we live in this telecom nerd world where we're so invested in the intricacies of the telecom market that we sometimes forget that it actually affects our fellow human beings.
Like nearly
also,
all 8 billion of them, really. So, yeah.
And also just basic real world events can affect the industry. So the first one, if we look back in the year in review, started in January, and that was a volcano not too far off of the islands that make up the country of Tonga erupted. Ended up being one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. It wasn't all that dramatic. It generated.
If you were in Tonga, it was, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, or Peru even. It generated some tsunamis that unfortunately killed a few people. But the eruption itself, besides the plume it created, wasn't all that dramatic, because all of the pyroclastic flow was under the water. You couldn't see it. So it's not like some of the volcanoes where you see this dramatic footage of lava spewing out or this huge cloud of debris coming down. But what we forget is that the seafloor is not just some flat, inert place. There are mountains there and hills and some critical pieces of infrastructure that connect us, which are undersea cables.
We have talked about this quite a bit. So, yeah.
TeleGeography makes maps of these cables.
We do indeed. I have one behind me every time I record. So
You do. So the pyroclastic flow or something, I believe it was the flow, was gigantic off of this volcano, and it caused a fault in the cable that connected Tonga to the rest of the world, the fiber optic cable. Very often with cable faults, it's one specific little fault. So it's like a ship dragging anchor or a fishing net getting snagged, and it's a not great deal of damage to the cable.
But not actually sharks most of the time, right?
That hasn't been recorded in about 40 years.
Yeah.
There was example of some shark bites a long time ago, but not since then. But geological disasters can also affect us, and it certainly affected here. They sent out a cable ship that arrived about a month after the eruption. Right. And they found that about 50-mile chunk of the cable had been destroyed.
Wow. Right. So very different where, like you said, most faults are in a very precise place. They just pull the cable up, splice that part. You're talking about a major relaying of cable in this case.
That's right. And most cable ships keep a lot of spare fiber optic cable on the ship for moments like this. But apparently it was such a large chunk missing that they ran out of spare cables, so that they had to send a second ship out later on to repair another section. They did get it repaired, but in the meantime, the people of Tonga were without fiber optic internet-based internet for over a month. And people joke, if I'm going to lose the internet, that means I can't check Facebook. No big deal. Or maybe it's going to be healthier for me. But that event really brought home how important telecommunications is. There were examples of people at ATMs, and there's an error message. It's offline. Right. So it's not just the internet, browsing the casual recreational internet that gets disrupted when there's a communications failure like this. Banks use it. Right. Governments use it. So fiber optic cables are pretty important. They were able to restore capacity, some capacity with satellites during the downtime. Almost immediately after the cable failure, Elon Musk tweeted that he's going to send Starlink terminals to Tonga and have restoration. And of course, all the Elon Musk reply guys tweeted, "Thank you, Elon. Thank you for saving Tonga. You are so wise." I don't know if Starlink actually restored services. They may well have, but most of the services were not over LEO satellites. It was over more old-fashioned geosynchronous satellites. Right. There are 3 different satellite constellations that were used. And, a big failure like this with the volcano, you think, is it even worth it having submarine cable? But it's really interesting to see the performance of the internet, how it changed once the cable was restored. Right. One of our friends in the industry, Doug Midori, is at Kintic, and they measure latency and all kinds of things in almost real time. And he tweeted out something really interesting. They could tell almost in real time when the cable was restored because they had been measuring latency over the satellites to Tonga, 670 milliseconds, almost 2/3 of a second. Yeah. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that's really unresponsive.
It can make a lot of applications fail to perform the way they're supposed to. So
exactly. And then once the cable was restored, it jumped immediately back down to 139 millisecond delay. So
now it's probably worth pointing out that very few places would be as tied to a single cable as an island geography like Tonga. So, but it's certainly conceivable that such a disaster could take out the majority of cables on some key routes, right?
Well, it's happened before. The gigantic earthquake off of Japan about 12 years ago, that it was a 9.0 or 9.1 on the Richter scale, and it moved the Earth, the Pacific plate or one of the plates, about 6 feet, I believe.
Wow, that's a big earthquake. Yeah.
Yeah. That ripped up a bunch of cables at once. Not every single Trans-Pacific cable was destroyed, but many were.
Right.
So it is possible. especially when there are cables that are routed through a fairly narrow corridor. That's a dangerous area.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of resiliency and disasters, there was another disaster that started about a month after the Tonga volcanoes, and that was Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine.
Indeed, yeah.
And that really did bring, for me at least, as a watcher of the telecom industry, a lot of the practical elements of telecommunications to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
Both how resilient a network can be, and also how critical telecommunications can be.
Right.
We so much of what we do with cloud services or telecom services, it seems so prosaic every day. And it's really interesting to see how the Ukraine military and government have used the same tools that we use for intra-corporate communications for fighting off this invasion.
Right. Even just bringing awareness to the world to raise money, to get support, that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, exactly. There was one moment when earlier in the war when Zelensky made a petition to Congress, basically, which was reminiscent of what Winston Churchill did in late 1941 or early 1942, I think. Churchill had to make a very dangerous crossing of the Atlantic. I believe he did it in a destroyer.
Right.
And so he can make an in-person visit to U.S. Congress. Zelensky did the same thing, but over Zoom.
Right.
It was literally over Zoom,
much
just
safer,
like any
more efficient.
Meeting.
Yeah.
And important because, just being able to see people in real time, there's something magical about that, something important, very human. And if you're making an appeal that's partly based on not just on national interests, but on emotion as well, there's no substitute for seeing another human being. So Zoom isn't one example. More recently, I saw a photo of Ukrainian commanders on Google Meet, and they were watching in real time a drone that they had up in the air and Russian armor coming in, and they were coordinating a defense against that Russian attack.
Yeah,
they were sending in artillery to counterattack the armor.
That is really fascinating. Just using these tools that we use every day for just boring meetings or whatever being used to craft world events is pretty amazing. Yeah,
exactly. Here are a few other examples too. Google Maps. People, if they have a phone and they have it turned on and they don't have the privacy settings set, their phone will ping to Google servers to let it know how fast they're going down a road. Right. And that's one of the ways Google can tell you, oh, there's a traffic jam up 5 miles from here. Right. And it shows as red, right, on your if you're using navigation. The night before the invasion, there was a big red line from a major Russian city to the Ukrainian border. And what it was likely Russian troops had failed to turn off their cell phones.
Right.
And they were sitting in a convoy ready to invade. So it showed as a traffic jam.
That is really interesting. It reminds me of a similar story. There was, if you know what Strava is, it's like the social media app for running and cycling and stuff like that, where you can post like how far you ran or did a cycling ride. And U.S. military guys were on Strava and posting their runs publicly, and they realized that they were giving away the location of their base because they're like out there running around their base or whatever. So definitely all these tools that we use every day in life take on a different character in wartime, certainly. So
yeah, you don't think of operational security when you're wearing a smartwatch or bringing your phone around, but it's nowadays, 21st century, it's pretty critical. Here's a last example. Do you or do your kids ever watch unboxing videos on YouTube? Is that still a thing?
I think so. I don't, but my kids do. Absolutely, yeah.
They probably haven't watched this one. I certainly hope not. But it was the strangest unboxing video I've ever seen. It was a Ukrainian soldier unboxing a gift from the United Kingdom, an anti-tank missile.
Oh, wow.
In law.
Yeah.
And he unboxed it carefully to show what it's like, and then he provided an instructional video of how to assemble it and how to fire the weapon against a hammer. So YouTube being for practical things, I mean, that was a real thing. It still is.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So I think both of your stories, the natural and the human disaster, kind of illustrate how deep the internet is into our lives, and in ways that you don't think about necessarily until they're missing or perhaps used in a different way or whatever. So all of this stuff that we do, the mapping, the infrastructure research, the pricing research is about probably the most critical piece of infrastructure arguably humanity has ever had across the earth. So,
well, over 99% of intercontinental communications happens over fiber optic submarine cables. Now, Ukraine is connected mainly through terrestrial cables to the rest of Europe. And there's a far greater degree of resiliency. There are far more physical paths. As you were mentioning with Tonga, it's only one cable. So if it goes down, that whole country's down. The Ukrainian internet has proven really resilient. That's been one interesting thing outcome of the conflict in terms of telecommunications infrastructure. There have been some instances when there's been a blip of a blackout, essentially, data blackout. Mostly that comes back. It's been rougher, though, the last month or two when the Russian government decided to switch tactics a little bit and deliberately go after the Ukrainian electrical infrastructure.
Right, because it's a lot of shared, well, first, obviously, central offices and whatnot need power, but also there's a lot of shared ducts and whatnot, right? So,
yeah, in fiber optic communications requires power. Submarine cables come with their own power source,
right?
And terrestrial have power huts occasionally that regenerate the signal. If they do not have electricity, you do not have internet. You don't have communication. So there's been more disruption over the last month or two than we saw in the previous 6 months of the war. So that's going to be something interesting to watch in 2023.
It is really sort of useful to point out and understand that terrestrial networks are still very hard to take down, because certainly it would benefit the Russians to have the Ukraine mostly off of the internet, and they, having not been able to achieve that for the past year in any kind of major way, I think is indicative of how difficult it must be. They certainly would want to.
Yeah, and before the war, there was a lot of speculation that the Russian government had really sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. And it didn't, a lot of the nightmare scenarios thought that there would be attacks, just virtual or cyber attacks on the telecom infrastructure in Ukraine. And we don't know, we the public don't really know exactly what has happened, but it didn't appear to happen. In February, March, April of this year. The connectivity to Ukraine has been fairly stable. The moments when there has been serious degradation is because of physical trauma to the network. We've seen photos of Ukrainian fiber optic engineers going out to the field, and there's this huge crater from an artillery strike, and they're in there splicing the fiber. So if you destroy the actual fiber or you take away the electricity that it needs, then there's a problem.
But the diffuse nature of terrestrial internet is such that often things can easily be rerouted. So you may have degradation in service, but it's really hard to have a complete blockage of service, essentially.
Unless there's an entire regional blackout, which there have been occasionally. And so that, if they can manage to keep the power up, the internet should be fine.
Well, your devices are mostly going to be down after a certain amount of time of the power being out anyway, right? So that's a kind of a dual problem there, right? So excellent. Well, this was really interesting, Tim, and I think there's some stuff that we can look out for over the next year. Obviously, we don't relish any kind of disaster, and the human toll of this is terrible, but it's really interesting to see the role that all of the kind of abstract things that we look at telegeography affect real lives.
Yeah.
And you're one of the only telegeographers who has regularly gotten to go on like real television and whatnot. I'm always stuck in the industry press kind of stuff. So folks can look out for you sometimes talking about some of this stuff on cable news and whatnot, right?
Yes, I suppose so.
Yeah. Too modest. All right. Thanks, Tim. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Greg.
Cheers. Thanks for listening. TeleGeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.